ready now. I'm Barbara Kerr. I'm a business analyst. I currently work at Fuse by Cardinal Health. I kind of joke that I've worked everywhere but Chase, which is basically true. I am here to talk to you today about waterfall requirements and how they still have a place in an agile world. And when I tell people, I've been working on this thought for a long time, and I've been incorporating it into my daily work for a long time. But when I tell people about this, developers especially often think that I'm crazy, and my goal today is not to get anyone to change their mind, but just maybe to expand your thoughts and be open to some new ways of thinking about this. And if you get something out of it, great. And if you don't, I hope that you feel like your hour has been worth it. I'm curious to know how many people here are developers or like truly hands-on tech people. I'm really surprised by that. I didn't know what a topic like this, what kind of appeal it might have if you're not an analyst, a tech writer, a trainer, a project manager, something like that. So even if you don't ask questions today, if you have any feedback for me afterwards, or you can email me, I'm just curious to know how this is received by a truly technical community. So Office Space is getting to be 20 years old now. It used to be required watching in IT. I don't know how many people have seen it, but I thought I'd start out with this great clip from Office Space because I think it explains so well how misunderstood the analyst role is.
What you do at Initech is you take the specifications from the customers and you bring them down to the software engineers.
Yes, that's right.
Well, then I just have to ask, why couldn't the customers just take them directly to the software people, huh?
Well, I'll tell you why. Because engineers are not good at dealing with customers.
So you physically take the specs from the customer?
Well, no, my secretary does that, or they're faxed.
So then you must physically bring them to the software people.
Well, no. Yeah, I mean, sometimes.
What would you say you do here?
Well, look, I already told you. I deal with the goddamn customers so the engineers don't have to. I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people. Can't you understand that? What the hell is wrong with you people?
There you go. My 80-year-old mother, who's a retired nurse, so she's an educated person, still to this day does not know what I do for a living. She just tells people I work with computers, and we kind of leave it at that. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, I just want to kind of prep you. I want to give a little intro and history about myself, because I think it paves the way for understanding how I arrived at some of the conclusions I have that I'm going to be presenting. And then I've given various iterations of this talk to much smaller groups of analysts. And I can't remember if I already mentioned this. I've never heard anyone talk about this before or like present these ideas, but for the people that it resonates with, it does seem to have real meaning. So I did develop it for a very specific audience, but hopefully it translates if you're not an analyst for the developers here. I have specific techniques that I want to give to you that you can walk away using. Sometimes I come to conferences or talks and it's very conceptual and it's very exciting, and then I leave and I don't actually know how to apply that information when I go back to my regular working life. So hopefully I can give you some things that you can actually use. And then not only am I talking at the heart about how waterfall and agile requirements techniques can work together in an agile world, but I want to talk about going forward. We have a lot of product focus these days as opposed to project focus, and I think it's a very natural segue to take this information about waterfall requirements and segue into project or product focused talk. So my history, I'm 52. I've been working in IT for 30 years, which is a long time and longer than most of my coworkers. And for 22 years of that, we only had waterfall. That's all we had. And literally, I felt like we woke up and waterfall was the biggest enemy to anybody ever working in IT. It was dead overnight. We were all going agile. And that was a hard pill for me to swallow because I'd sort of built my career on being a good communicator, producing lots of documentation, producing waterfall requirements, doing large path requirements before a single line of code got written. And so what I heard which is partially true and partially my own bias, was that documentation doesn't matter, requirements don't matter, and there's no point in working ahead because change is inevitable. And I really kind of questioned whether I had a future in what I'd built my career on. The good news is that I do. I'm very much employed on a career path that I'm very happy with my work. And I have come to love Agile, but I am not a purist. I believe it has its place. I don't believe it's right for everything. And I believe that there's no point in throwing away everything that we knew before for the sake of a buzzword. Agile is definitely more than a buzzword, but for a long time, that's what I felt like it was. It was sort of a flavor of the month thing. So I do want to say, once again, I've never seen anything online. I've never heard another person talk about the things that I'm going to talk to you about today. There's a good chance that you may not agree with anything I have to say. You may partially agree, but as I said, if it gives you something to think about, a way to approach your work, then hopefully it will be an hour well spent. So my audience, I kind of initially started developing this for people, BAs specifically, who were new to Agile. And believe it or not, we have plenty of shops in town throughout the country that are not Agile for a number of reasons. Even within my own organization, we have teams and pockets of people in different departments that are still doing strictly Waterfall. So we do all the time have people new to Agile and they don't understand how to do requirements in sort of their new world. This may be you. You may ask yourself if everything that you knew before, if you have made the transition, is all for naught, if you can still use it. And even if you're well immersed in Agile, you may want to borrow something from your previous life if you had a Waterfall experience. And for many of you, simply because of the age that you are, or the generation that you came into IT, you have no Waterfall experience. You don't really know what it's about, and you wouldn't know how to borrow if you could. So if you're any one of these people, and maybe even more, hopefully something will resonate. So again, it's easy for a BA to think that requirements don't matter in Agile. They very much do. Your vernacular changes, the words you change, your approach to work may change somewhat, but you don't need to abandon your experience and common sense. Good BA practices and principles will never die. I always say one of the best things a BA can do is just ask the right questions and ask every stupid question, because ultimately you uncover things that people that are too close to the subject matter don't. So this is the section where I want to give you specific techniques to think about when applying Waterfall elicitation techniques to an Agile situation. The first one has a two-part. Go broad in requirements gathering before you go deep. I love this graphic. This graphic maybe single-handedly made me understand Agile better than anything else that I'd heard. A lot of people think that Agile is piecemealing things broadly, deeply rather than broadly. So the analogy I had in my head when I first started hearing about Agile was, okay, if you're building a car, we talk a lot about MVP in the Agile world, you can't just deliver a steering wheel. It's meaningless. How do you deliver just part of something without a whole thing working? What constitutes a truly valuable MVP? So when I saw this graphic, and the idea is you don't just deliver a wheel and then an axle and then a body, you actually deliver something that works on a very basic level right out of the gate. And so when I think about gathering requirements, I like to think very broadly across the top, big areas of requirements before I go deep on each one, because 1B is the big picture matters. I think even in an Agile world, especially in an Agile world, the more you know earlier, the better off any project is, and that goes definitely for software development. So the more epics or features that you can identify early on give you the best big picture that you can come up with. And so from an architecture perspective, from a technical perspective, the more you know about the big picture up front, the better you are to be scalable with your solution as you iterate. Developers like Agile, and we like to think about Agile from a development perspective, from avoiding bugs. But from a requirements perspective, if you can think big picture before getting started, you can avoid tech debt and reiterating to the point that it just doesn't make any sense. So I'm always a proponent of the more you know sooner, the better off you are. Thinking big picture kind of helps you, and thinking big picture is very much a holdover from the Waterfall days. I think it tends to get muddied in Agile. I think a lot of people think that the big picture is not important because they're focused on individual features, but I think it's important to think about features in context to all the other features that you want to develop. Number 2, nothing should stop you from working as far ahead as you can if you're an analyst, if you're in a position to gather requirements. We're all strapped for time in our jobs, and it's easy to let the day-to-day keep you from working ahead. But if you're thinking big picture from the start, there's nothing to stop you in those moments of the day where you have a few minutes to developing those big picture, high-level requirements into detailed requirements, because you're going to use those to stock your backlog. One of the big tenets of Agile is, well, we have to do this because requirements change. Yes, requirements change. Details change, they are tweaked, features change priority, but I personally have never seen every feature, every single requirement become invalid overnight. Features get scrapped, that's something different. But no matter how far you work ahead, I would say it's a fairly safe bet that at least 50% of those requirements will still be around, even if you don't get around to developing months or years later, because customers, especially if they're non-technical, their needs typically don't change. They know what they need, they know what they want. So working ahead should not be thought of as something that is a bad thing or a waste of your time. Even if you need to scrap a whole set of requirements or a whole area of requirements or a whole feature, you're still thinking big picture, and that sort of tees you up to still ask good questions along the way. So again, work as far ahead as time allows. I have never found that to be a waste of my time personally. So then as you're working broad and then you're going deep and you're building a backlog, you have quite a bit in your backlog at any given amount of time, your backlog should drive your product owner discussions. And here again, I'm going to deviate a little bit from conventional thinking. Yes, the product owner does own the backlog. They do set priorities, but I think it's the responsibility of the BA to be the technical liaison to the product owner. And the reason is, even the savviest product owners, unless they are truly technical, don't always understand what it takes to get something built. It could look very easy to them, but behind the scenes or under the hood, it's very technical, can take longer. The ramifications of doing something could cause something else to break or be limited. So the BA is the liaison between the technical and the business community. A very well-stocked backlog can help your product owner see the big picture and make informed decisions. By giving your product owner a starting point and not just letting them run with whatever prioritization is, I think you end up with something more balanced and more doable long-term. So I mentioned product owners are not often technical. They don't understand the risk-reward of working features in a certain order. So yes, we all agree that A, B, and C are important. Product owner may say A is important from a business perspective. Your developer could be saying, well, we absolutely need to do C first because that code base is going to enable us to do A. And as the BA, if you have a well-stocked backlog and you have a relationship with both sides of the coin, you are in a position to bring everyone to agreement and drive them to making the right prioritization decisions. So the bigger your backlog, the better prioritization serves both the needs of the business and the technical community. One thing that may help you if you're transitioning from Waterfall to Agile or struggling to understand Waterfall or Agile is to think of your sprints as 2-week waterfalls. It's always going to be true that you have an analysis, design, code, test, deploy. In Agile, they're greatly compressed. It helps me to think of every sprint as a mini waterfall simply because I can tee up for the next 2 weeks what I need to do, how deep I need to go with detailed requirements, what my backlog needs to be continually fed, and it tees me up then for subsequent sprints. So again, I think what I heard when I was new to Agile, and I think still tends to be true, is that we discourage this sort of analyze, design, code, test, deploy. Those things always have to happen. Even if they happen sort of all at once or in a compressed timeline, you should still recognize that there are distinct phases to software development. User stories. They are not one size fit all. I know in our old Waterfall days, we talked a lot, the system must, the system shall, that kind of language, and we would do all of our requirements up front before a single line of code was written. You may be under the impression, you may have been told, that user stories and gherkins are the only way to express requirements. And I will tell you very much that I disagree with that. They do have a place with customer and user focused facing features. Not everything is an interactive feature for a user or a customer. We have things like data, security, maintenance. We have complete system requirements that have nothing to do with a user experience. I worked at a company once, and there's a person here who I used to work with at that company. When they were new to Agile, one of their user stories or a set of user stories started out as a data element. I want to be X data element so I can insert myself into the database. This makes no sense. So user stories are great tools for thinking about cause and effect in an interface or for a user-focused feature. They do not work for everything, and I want to say there's no shame in falling back on waterfall requirements language for bigger picture needs for software. Tech debt, infrastructure, all of these types of items, we can't use user stories for those, and they are very important. However, no matter what form your requirements take, they need to be well-formed, whether it's gherkin, which is test, user stories, traditional requirements. Everything needs to be quantifiable, everything needs to be testable, everything needs to be unambiguous, because your user of these requirements are the people building the systems, and we all need to be very clear about what it is that we're building. Number 6, know when Agile isn't the answer. A lot of people have had the Agile Kool-Aid and they think it's right for everything. It's actually not, and even by industry standards, it's not, so I think it's important that we remember this. Regulatory projects, and these overlap a little bit. Where projects are very detailed, known, or rigid, which tend to be regulatory type projects. If you have one chance to do something, maybe you are trying to entice an outside customer. I know a lot of us work for internal IT departments, but if you're building something that you want to sell or you want to possibly sell, you get one chance to wow somebody. Agile isn't the answer. Also, if you have a hard and fast deadline, one of the tenets of Agile will say that the development team really should be able to say how much they can do and how long it will take them. I have never worked for a company where they said, you guys just take as long as you need, you tell us how long it's going to take, get back to us, we're great with that. It doesn't happen that way. We're all given deadlines, and when that happens, it is much better to know the scale of everything that you want to do and clearly what's expected. And in those situations, I think waterfall requirements techniques will serve you very well. Finally, good BA skills never go out of style. I did ask how many developers were here. How many BAs are here? How many analysts? Fewer than developers, which is interesting. The things that you do every day are going to be true no matter what methodologies we come up with. Ask tough questions. It's your duty. It's basically what you're paid for, to ask the right questions and ask the tough questions. This will never go out of style. If it helps you to document traditional waterfall requirements just as a running list, maybe no one will ever see it, before you start breaking down cards and writing user stories and gherkins, go ahead and do that. And if you share it with somebody else, they may get something out of it too. You always need to be working very closely with your developers because usually they're the consumers of your output. You can't break down work for them. You might suggest something, but ultimately the technical community is going to decide how best to tackle a given task when it comes to coding or building. And requirements need to match up with the way that they want to implement them. So the better relationship you have with your developers, which I think is something that any BA who manages to do well is doing already, but it's still as important as it's ever been. And again, just asking the big picture questions, not just tough questions about individual requirements, but the big picture becomes important. So bringing it all together, I mentioned that I'm kind of aiming this towards product thinking. This is something that's kind of evolved out of my earlier incarnations of this talk. But we're hearing a lot these days about product versus project. And again, project is concerned with resources like time, money, and people, schedules, things like that. Product is concerned with the deliverable. Requirements matter with product. And to me, product sounds an awful lot like waterfall requirements. I know a lot of people would disagree with me, but if you're really aiming for the best possible thing you can deliver, if you're thinking product-centric, it's important to know overall before you start what it is you want to end up with. So I put a couple of quotes up here. I don't want to read these word for word, and if anybody wants to look this up later, the URLs are there. But in this first one, the thing that I want to focus on, it says, the product owner should focus on the what. This means his or her job is to take a long-term view. It's hard to take a long-term view if you don't know what the big picture is. And it's hard to take a big picture view of something if you're doing just-in-time requirements for the next 2 weeks. So teeing up the big picture is critical to product. Second quote, of course, deadlines, budget, and scope are important, but in the end, it's all about building the right product for the customer. From the first graphic, if you deliver a skateboard as the MVP, but the customer wants a Tesla, they're going to be disappointed even though you delivered something that met their need to get from point A to point B. And if you truly have an external customer that's expecting something much closer to a true final product, you have to think big picture, and the way to do that is starting with your requirements. And then the third quote, rather than focusing on the output, product thinking is focused on outcome. Again, we are looking at the product, the final product. Customers want to see as close to their image in their mind as they can, and producing something that's a very scaled back but functional version often leaves people disappointed. I think letting product-focused thinking, and if you think of waterfall requirements techniques, be your focus, it will help you strike a balance between iterating and chasing your tail. How many people feel like sometimes iterating is an excuse for the customer to just drag on and on and on what changes they want to make? Yeah, I think iterating it's always going to be true. Even in the old waterfall days, we all had the expectation that once you sent your big thing out there after months or even years, the customer was going to request changes. That's going to happen. There's a difference between iterating and just being a whipping boy. Customers can come back time and time and time again asking for small changes just because that window is open in Agile, and I think sometimes that hurts us. So iterating, in my opinion, should be focused on things like, that button's green, but I really wanted it to be blue. Not, well, now that I see this, I really don't like the way we approach this feature, let's start again. I think it just would be better if we completely pivoted, which often, because of time and money, just isn't possible. So if you start with a product-focused view and you start with a larger set of requirements and therefore a larger backlog, I think once you get something to market, iterating becomes truly what it was intended to be and not just an open door to make changes ad nauseum. Faster, better, cheaper. I don't hear this a lot anymore, but any manufacturing endeavor, including software development, you used to hear a lot about faster, better, cheaper, and that you can only have 2 of them. That's pretty much true no matter what industry you're in, whether you're building cars or widgets or software. Agile and waterfall kind of, in some ways, sort of suck at both, but in Agile, you get something faster. You may not get ideal faster, and I think we fall into a pitfall with Agile that getting something faster means you're automatically faster, when in fact the customer may not be any happier with the MVP than they would be if they waited a little longer and got their ideal. We know that waterfall's not faster, but It can be faster if the analyst is allowed to work a little bit ahead, not months, not even necessarily weeks, but rather than giving an analyst a few hours to write a few user stories, if an analyst has an opportunity to dig in and really do big picture, even just high-level requirements as a first pass, and then go back and iterate to get detailed requirements as they go, it can be faster in the long run because developers are more focused on what exactly they have to build. So software development's not fast. Agile gives the illusion of being faster, and in some ways it is, but it can be sort of a tortoise and a hare thing, that you get a running start right out of the gate, but the hare could often beat them in the end because they've been slow-paced and more methodical about it. Better. Better goes a little bit along with the faster that I was pointing out. Yes, you iterate, you're always going to have continuous improvement, whether you've done Agile, Waterfall, or a combination. As long as a customer has a say in requesting changes, changes are going to come in, hopefully always resulting in something better. But if you're always going for an MVP, which we are taught to think about in Agile, better is always the next thing. And it becomes elusive. It's like the horizon, you never really get there. So if you can build in better from the start by thinking more big picture and doing more complete requirements deep diving, you may get something better sooner, and your initial or your first few MVPs could be a bigger bang for your buck than if you don't consider those things. We know that cheaper doesn't generally apply to Agile. I don't know that Waterfall was cheaper either. I think software development is purely just an overhead expense, and there's not getting around that. But if you can be smarter about how you're working, you may be able to manage expectations and costs as you go. So, the best of both worlds. I've been saying for a long time, and again, a lot of people think that I'm crazy, but I've been doing this and it seems to be working. I think the ideal combination is that we continue to have Agile development sprints. And by Agile, I mean Scrum, Kanban, whatever flavor you're doing. I think it's always really valuable to think about just the next 2 weeks instead of the next year and a half. It also allows developers to pivot because changes do come in. Even with Agile, changes come in mid-sprint that we are required to address. It's going to happen. However, if you can continue to work requirements and your backlog in somewhat of a waterfall fashion, the sprints, I think, become more meaningful. They're more focused. They help with sprint goals. If that's something that you do, I know I always struggle with a sprint goal when I'm trying to work on that, other than just get our cards done. But I really believe that just because you have waterfall requirements doesn't mean you can't do Agile software development and all the other ceremonies of Agile. And that's actually my talk. What time is it? I was worried about filling up the whole hour. It's 1:30? 1:30, okay. Does anybody have any questions or anything that you'd like to talk about? Yes.